Listen, hear ye not the sighing of the goddess freedom dying, on the fields of Kansas lying, weltering in her gore? Hear ye not her mournful pleading? See ye not her votaries bleeding? Lo, their souls from earth receding call for vengeance sore. A plea for Kansas.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here, and today we begin to confront the issue most responsible for division in 19th century America: slavery. Indeed, slavery had become something of a sleeping giant in 19th century politics. Yet, up until the 1850s, politicians had mostly succeeded in keeping the issue in slumber. But the political and cultural landscape was changing fast as the century reached its halfway point, and increasingly, the peculiar institution of slavery could not be ignored. Today, we'll explore the final attempts to compromise on slavery and discuss why they ultimately failed. But first, as we always do, let's ask a big question. Is compromise an effective legislative strategy? In the United States, compromise is as storied as the nation itself. The country was founded on it. Compromise was the essence of the U.S. Constitution. Compromise was then responsible for that document's ratification. And compromise was key to establishing the national economy during the Washington administration. Compromise ended the nullification crisis in the 1830s, settled the disputed election of 1876, and even allowed for the passage of long overdue civil rights legislation in the 1960s. But a flurry of compromises on slavery in the 19th century calls into question the efficacy of the method. Legislators became quite good at compromising on this issue. Henry Clay practically made his name of it. Yet, the Civil War still came, and more than 600,000 people died as a result. Were these compromises noble attempts to fix a broken nation, or did they simply delay or even worsen an inevitable crisis? Let's take a look. Our first big idea provides historical context for today's discussion by tracing the history of compromise on slavery. Antebellum politicians recognized that the issue of slavery had a destabilizing effect on national unity. As a result, they endeavored to keep the issue out of the national discourse, using compromise to settle disagreements. In 1820, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Massachusetts Congressman John Holmes. In that letter, he addressed America's complicated relationship with slavery. Jefferson remarked, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go." Jefferson recognized that slavery in America was a moral and ideological contradiction. But as a Virginian and a slave owner, he was also acutely aware of the South's attachment to the peculiar institution. And Jefferson wasn't alone in this assessment. Indeed, many American politicians recognized that slavery threatened national unity. But because they saw no clear path to slavery's abolition, most endeavored to keep the issue out of national politics altogether. The logic here was that if we're not all talking about slavery, we won't fight about it. Compromise proved an effective method to do this. American leaders first compromised on slavery during the Constitutional Convention. At that time, the Three-Fifths Compromise settled the issue of representation in the national legislature. This largely shelved questions about slavery for about 30 years. But as America stretched westward, new concerns arose over the fate of slavery in Western territories. So Henry Clay helped to strike the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which again tabled the issue. The conversation reemerged in 1836, when the Republic of Texas won independence from Mexico and asked to be admitted to the U.S. as a slave state. Rather than confronting the issue then, Congress instituted a gag rule, which forbid legislators from the mere mention of slavery on the floor of Congress. Presidents Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, and Tyler all ignored Texas in order to keep slavery out of the national conversation. But James K. Polk's expansionist agenda bucked this pattern. His annexation of Texas and addition of the Mexican cession through war brought the issue of slavery to the forefront of national politics. With tensions rising, it seemed that compromise would soon be needed again. And indeed, that compromise would come in 1850. The factors at play are outlined in our second big idea. Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850 was a suite of legislative measures intended to end the debate over slavery in the territories. It was brought on by the annexation of Texas, the Mexican War, the Underground Railroad, and the California Gold Rush. The debate over slavery in the territories reached a peak in the late 1840s. It began with the annexation of slaveholding Texas in 1845, which tipped the balance of power in the Senate towards the South. Northerners grew increasingly alarmed when President Polk provoked war with Mexico, a war that many viewed as a Southern plot to expand slavery across the continent. The conclusion of that war gave the United States the Mexican Cession, a vast expanse of southwestern territory in which the fate of slavery was shrouded in uncertainty. Meanwhile, in the East, the cultural conflict over slavery intensified as abolitionist leaders took bolder action. A network of safe houses managed by anti-slavery operatives comprised the Underground Railroad, which helped enslaved people in the South escape to free soil in Pennsylvania and New York. The most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who navigated the Maryland wilderness 19 times and escorted over 300 enslaved people to freedom. As the operations of the Underground Railroad expanded in the 1840s, and as Northerners became increasingly willing to harbor those who had escaped bondage, tensions escalated between North and South, especially near the Mason-Dixon line. Then, the plot thickened in 1848, when a chance event changed the trajectory of westward migration patterns and reshaped the conversation about slavery. James Wilson Marshall, a New Jersey carpenter turned frontiersman, discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California. The discovery touched off the California Gold Rush, which attracted large numbers of settlers to the territory, mostly from the North and West. As a result of this population boom, California was able to petition for statehood as a free state by 1849. But by that time, Iowa and Wisconsin had added their own stars to the flag, evening the count of free and slave states at 15 each. No other Mexican Cession territory was ready to enter the Union along with California, so the addition of California threatened to hand control of the Senate to Northern interests. Indeed, the country was ripe for compromise, and the job seemed perfect for the so-called Great Compromiser, Henry Clay. Clay brokered a four-part compromise in 1850 that he hoped would solve the California problem, the Underground Railroad problem, and settle the fate of slavery in all remaining territories. The four parts were as follows. First, California was to be admitted as a free state. This, of course, pleased the North, as it gave free states a numerical advantage in the Senate. Second, the people of New Mexico and Utah territories would decide by a vote whether or not slavery would be permitted there. This was known as the doctrine of popular sovereignty. The South liked this, as it all but secured another slave state in New Mexico with the chance to add Utah as well. Third, the slave trade ended in Washington, D.C. Now, this is more of a symbolic move, but one the North had been calling for a long time. You see, in the 1840s, Washington, D.C. was a hub for the domestic slave trade, and shackled men and women were frequently marched in front of the U.S. Capitol building to a slave auction block that was within a few hundred yards of the White House. Northerners pointed out the hypocrisy of selling human beings as property in the shadow of our national symbols of freedom and democracy. To be clear, slavery was still legal in D.C. after 1850, but the market was shut down within the city. The final part of the compromise was a new Fugitive Slave Law that allowed Southerners to recapture escaped slaves in the North, an attempt to stifle the activities of the Underground Railroad. Henry Clay hoped that since each section could claim wins in the Compromise of 1850, slavery could fade out of the national conversation and the nation could heal its divisions. Unfortunately for the Great Compromiser, the opposite happened. The effects of the Compromise of 1850 are the subject of our third big idea. The Compromise of 1850 backfired. by elevating the doctrine of popular sovereignty, increasing abolitionism in the North, and fracturing the second-party system. The Compromise of 1850 was one of the last major efforts of Henry Clay's storied political career, and sadly, it's hard to see that compromise as anything other than a failure. Not only did it fail to address the issue of slavery directly, it failed in removing slavery from the national conversation. It did, however, have important effects. First, the compromise introduced the concept of popular sovereignty. Since voting on slavery seemed like the sexy thing to do, since it was the most democratic, the doctrine was floated as a possibility in other areas as well. In particular, that territory that had been declared free by the Missouri Compromise in 1820. But more on this a little later. Second, the Compromise of 1850 actually caused a sharp increase in abolitionism in the North. This was largely thanks to the unintended consequences of the new Fugitive Slave Law. The Fugitive Slave Law actually required Northerners to assist Southern slave catchers and plantation owners in recapturing runaway slaves. Withholding information about the whereabouts of runaways became a federal offense. This forced many Northerners to choose between violating their conscience and going to jail. It also gave many Northerners their first real look at chattel slavery. When runaways were apprehended in the North, they were often shackled and marched back to the nearest port to be returned to the South. This gave Northerners, most of whom who had never been south of the Mason-Dixon line, a first-hand look at the inhumanity of slavery. Of course, Northerners knew that slavery existed, but many remarked that seeing it with their own eyes stoked a new fire about the institution's immorality. So, in the wake of these scenes, the abolitionist message became increasingly popular. In literature, William Lloyd Garrison continued to spread the abolitionist gospel in his newspaper, The Liberator. Novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe depicted the immorality of slavery in vivid detail in her 1852 book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became the best-selling novel of the 19th century. Activists like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass wrote essays and gave speeches across the North, speaking firsthand about their own experiences with slavery. One of Douglass's most famous speeches came in 1852 when he was asked by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society to deliver remarks at a 4th of July celebration. While many expected Douglass to speak with a unique perspective about the American ideal of freedom, few predicted the tongue-lashing that ensued. Douglass delivered a scathing critique of American identity as the land of the free. Here's the speech in its entirety, performed by actor James Earl Jones. Pay attention as Douglass points out the hypocrisy of the Independence Day celebration.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour forth a stream, a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
The rise of abolitionism after the Compromise of 1850 heightened the tensions between North and South, and each section grew increasingly suspicious of the other. And these suspicions spilled over into politics as well. The political parties each suffered their own identity crises following the Compromise of 1850, changing the political landscape and ending the second party system. Remember, both parties avoided the issue of slavery in the 1830s and 1840s, and as a result, the political parties actually weren't divided by region. In fact, in 1848, both the Democratic and Whig Party enjoyed substantial support from both sections. But with slavery back on the menu and with the Compromise of 1850's failure to deal with it, the parties began to fracture along familiar sectional lines. Northern Whigs couldn't find common ground with Southern Whigs on the issue of slavery, and the party ultimately collapsed under its weight. The Whigs never recovered from the division that slavery had caused, and the 1852 election demonstrates just how far the party had fallen in the span of only 4 years. But the Democratic Party, too, was sagging under the weight of slavery. Democrats hoped to avoid the fate of the Whigs, but in order to do that, they would need to temper the slavery issue, and fast. It seemed that by 1854, another compromise was badly needed. This is our fourth big idea. The KansasNebraska Act was the final major attempt to compromise on slavery, and like the Compromise of 1850, it backfired and actually increased sectional tension. Contrary to the hopes of many Washington politicians, the fervor around slavery had not subsided by 1854. A growing abolitionist presence in the North heightened Southern anxieties over the future of the institution. Unable to find common ground on the issue, the Whig Party dissolved, and it appeared as though the Democrats were headed for a similar fate. So a Democratic senator from Illinois named Stephen Arnold Douglas attempted to fill the void left by the passing of Henry Clay, and offered a new plan that he hoped would unite the Democratic Party and put the issue of slavery back to sleep. His plan was known as the KansasNebraska Act, and it originated from the need to organize the remaining territories of the Louisiana Purchase so that work could continue on a transcontinental railroad. Now, the fate of slavery in this region had already been decided by the Missouri Compromise, which dictated that all territories north of 3630 would be off limits to slavery. But Douglas believed that he and his fellow Northern Democrats needed to make a peace offering to the South in order to ease tensions and reunite the party. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise, divided the remaining unorganized territory in two, and held that popular sovereignty would decide the fate of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. Now, Douglas's plan relied on a couple assumptions. Douglas assumed, since historically Americans tended to migrate from east to west, that Nebraska would be settled by Northerners from Iowa and Wisconsin and would become a free state. Kansas, he assumed, would be settled by way of Missouri and Kentucky and would enter as a slave state. Each section would therefore add 2 senators, and the sectional balance would be maintained. Douglas hoped that this would allow Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats to put the issue of slavery behind them, unite, and usher in a new era of good feelings. Unfortunately for Douglas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act proved to be a big miscalculation. Rather than unite the Democratic Party, the act divided it further. Northerners thought Douglas a traitor for repealing the Missouri Compromise, and Southerners thought Douglas a traitor for leaving slavery's fate up to a vote. And the vitriol intensified when Kansas became a battleground. Rather than attracting normal settlers, Kansas attracted partisans and extremists, whose sole motivation was to ensure or prevent the extension of slavery to that territory. Fearful of losing the state to slavery, Northern anti-slavers organized mass migrations of free soilers into Kansas, an attempt to populate the territory with anti-slavery voters. The most famous of these efforts was the New England Immigrant Aid Company, an organization founded by Boston reformer Eli Thayer. Lawrence, Kansas was founded by members of his first settlement effort. But unwilling to surrender Kansas to free soil interests, pro-slavers in Missouri sprang into action. Missouri Senator David Atchison encouraged pro-slavery Missourians to flood into Kansas on Election Day to cast illegal ballots for pro-slavery candidates. And they did. The territorial elections were obviously fraudulent, and there was ample evidence. In one instance, more than 5,000 pro-slavery votes were cast in a district that housed less than 3,000 total eligible voters. Despite the foul play, Democratic President Franklin Pierce certified the election and recognized the pro-slavery legislature. This only emboldened free soilers who stepped up their migration efforts and established the Free State Party to try to wrestle control of the territory from the bogus pro-slavery legislature. By 1858, these efforts paid off, and Free Staters achieved an overwhelming majority in the territory, sealing Kansas's fate to enter the Union as a free state. But heightened tensions in Kansas attracted extremists from both sides, and violence soon broke out. John Brown, a radical abolitionist from New England, came to Kansas as part of his stated mission to end slavery through violence. Brown was deeply religious and subscribed to an anti-slavery philosophy that invoked the Old Testament. He once remarked, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And Brown lived by that precept. On one evening in 1856, John Brown and several of his followers went to the homes of 6 known pro-slavery settlers near Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas. He called the residents out of their homes and split their heads with broadswords. Brown and his men dismembered their victims and left them in the woods, to be discovered the next morning by their wives and children. Brown fled the territory in the wake of the murders, but the brutality of his crimes inspired a violent pro-slavery response. The town of Lawrence, headquarters to the Free State Party, was ransacked and burned by a posse led by the pro-slavery sheriff of Douglas County. Then, in 1858, a group of Southerners led by Georgia native Charles Hamilton rounded up 11 Free State settlers near Trading Post, Kansas. He marched them into a ravine near the Merdazine River and shot them in cold blood. This violence in Kansas did not go unnoticed in the East. Northern and Southern newspapers used the Pottawatomie Creek and Merdazine massacre to illustrate the violent extremism of the political opposition. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune coined the developments Bleeding Kansas, and depicted pro-slavery operatives as murderers and maniacs, deepening the cultural divide between North and South. Southern papers gave similar treatment to Free State interests, claiming that all Northerners shared the radical and violent inclinations of Old John Brown. Violent blowback from the KansasNebraska Act even manifested on the floor of Congress in 1856 with the Brooks-Sumner affair. In May of that year, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gave a speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he suggested that Kansas was being victimized by the slaveholding South. He remarked of the Southern slave power, "Not in any common lust for power did this uncommon tragedy have its origin. It is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery, and it may be clearly traced to the depraved desire for a new slave state, hideous offspring of such a crime, in the hope of adding to the power of slavery in the national government." And Sumner's imagery didn't stop there. Sumner went on to call out South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, who had co-authored the KansasNebraska Act with Stephen Douglas. Sumner remarked, in so many words, that slavery was a prostitute, and Butler, her loyal customer. Senator Butler was not in the chamber when Sumner delivered these remarks, but his cousin was. Preston Brooks was a representative from South Carolina and a relative of Butler. 2 days after Sumner's speech, Brooks entered the Senate chamber and proceeded to beat Sumner unconscious with a gold-tipped cane. The violence on the Senate floor was a dark omen of things to come. It revealed the total breakdown of civility and trust between Northerners and Southerners. The Civil War was still nearly 5 years away, but the effects of the Compromise of 1850 and the KansasNebraska Act may well have rendered it inevitable. And that brings us back to the big question. What does this period in American history tell us about the efficacy of compromise? In theory, compromises work when opposing sides can stomach small concessions in exchange for modest progress toward their goals. And my purpose today is not to suggest that this strategy should never be employed, but the benefit of hindsight has shown us that the multitude of attempts to compromise on the issue of slavery ultimately failed. Perhaps this is because slavery was simply too polarizing an issue, and neither side was really willing to accept the gains of the other. Southerners became increasingly suspicious when the Senate went back to the North, and Northerners instantly regretted the Fugitive Slave Law. Alternatively, maybe these compromises failed because they ignored the root cause of the division and sought only to purge the country of the rhetoric surrounding it. Or maybe compromising on a moral issue like slavery was always a recipe for disaster. Compromise certainly has its place in American history, and if the nation is to endure, it will no doubt play a role in future developments as well. But if the 1850s taught us anything, it's that we should take great care in deciding the issues on which we compromise for the good of the country, and the issues on which we do not, for the good of the country. Next time, we'll take the final steps down this road towards civil war, and the nation will face its first real existential crisis. See you then.